joint work with Philippe de Rijk. My colleague is also here present at the conference, and he's actually the lead developer of CsFire. So if you have any additional questions about the implementation, you can contact me, but you can also contact Philippe. So the talk of today will be on CsFire. It's actually a browser-enforced mitigation technique against cross-site request forgery. I myself am a researcher at the Digital Research Group of the Catholic Universiteit Leuven, and I'm also actively engaged in OWASP. I'm a board member of the Belgian chapter, but I was also participating in organizing the academic track on previous Europe editions of the conference. But for today, I want to talk about cross-site request forgery. The outline of the talk looks as follows. I will start with giving you some background on cross-site request forgery, just to make sure that the whole group is on the same baseline. Next thing I will do is actually talk a little bit more about what is the typical behavior or nowadays behavior of web applications. How do they interact with each other? What are the requests that are sent out over the wire? With that information in our mind, with that quantification, we can actually look how mitigation against cross-site request forgery makes sense. And within this presentation, we will mainly focus on client-side mitigation techniques. We will see which approaches already exist and what are the requirements for doing good client-side mitigation against cross-site request forgery. Taking those requirements into account, I will actually show you how we developed CsFire, what's the real core of our countermeasure on the client side, and I also will discuss how we did the evaluation up until now, and then I will wrap up this talk. But as promised, I will give you a little introduction on cross-site request forgery. It has many synonyms, but the baseline is some HTML feed is under control of the attacker. It could be that the attacker owns its own server or hacked into a server, and that HTML feed is presented to the victims. That HTML feed triggers end users in sending a request to a targeted server. Those requests are happening in the background, are not authorized by the victim, but from the server-side perspective, those requests are legitimate. They are actually sent on behalf of that victim. In this scenario, what is typical is that the victim itself has an account to the targeted web server, and in the browser session that is going on, the victim was already logged in to the targeted web server. Let's have a look to a small example. So in this picture, you see the vulnerable server on the right side. This is providing the HTML feed under control of the attacker. There are different scenarios how this could happen. For example, by doing a SQL injection. In this case, let's say the attacker is doing a persistent cross-site scripting attack to the vulnerable server. So the attacker is uploading payload to the vulnerable server, and from then the payload is residing on the vulnerable server. So this is the HTML feed from now on under control of the attacker. When the victim is visiting the vulnerable server, it will send a regular request to the vulnerable server. It will be downloading the payload into its browser. The payload will start rendering and executing, and while executing, it might send requests to the targeted server. So this is actually the server we want to attack with the victim's account. Those requests are sent by the victim, although the victim is typically not aware of those requests being sent out, but the targeted server accepts them, and from his point, those requests are valid. So the main problem exists here, the trust relationship between the victim and the targeted server. If you have a closer look to that trust relationship, the main problem is that for all requests sent between the browser and the server, the implicit authentication is providing trust. So for each request, the client can send HTTP credentials like basic authentication, could send cookies with a session identifier, could use client-side SSL or just its IP address as the baseline for authentication and authorization. For each request following on the login session of the user, all those requests still have the implicit authentication with them. All subsequent requests have that implicit authentication connected to that request. So each request an end user is actually sending to that server later on will contain the same credentials. And even in the implicit authentication, some of the techniques are completely transparent. If you're using NTLM-based authentication, all the authentication authorization process happens based on your IP address. You don't even explicitly need to log in to a website in order for CSRF to happen. So what are the risk considerations taking this into account? Actually, any HTML feed that your users are accessing of your targeted server could be harmful. And the impact could be sending unauthorized requests, as we saw here. For example, doing some wire transfer on your bank, doing some shopping on an e-shop. It could also be that he's taking over your blog or your forum. But you have other attacks as well, as the login CSRF, or even attacking the internet. But I won't be discussing those today. What's also important in the context of this presentation today, for implicit authentication, I will focus on HTTP authentication and on the cookies. We'll keep the rest out of the scope of this presentation. To give you more idea about what is real impact of cross-site request forgery, for those who don't know this technical report, I think it's a good read up to know what is the impact of cross-site request forgery. It's written by Zoller and Felton in the late 2008. And what they did was actually visiting 4 major websites, and they found cross-site request vulnerabilities in each of those websites. And they really described how they attacked that website and what was the reason why they could attack, why there are no mitigation techniques there. Now, major websites like the New York Times, but also the online bank ING Direct, and it's really good read up to actually persuade you that cross-site request forgery is a real problem nowadays in the wild. But that's enough to have the baseline on cross-site request forgery. Let's have a look in what traffic we're generating in our daily behavior. We needed to have a little bit better insights in our nowadays browsing behavior to identify the nature of nowadays web interactions, because web interactions changed a lot over the last few years. And we also saw in the mitigation techniques that it's very important to find a good balance between usability and security. We saw already in the keynote that you have to present accuracy, but also completeness. So in that sense, you have to find a good balance between your delivering good security, but the security is still usable for your end users. And we actually try to quantify data because we don't have a Google lab residing the whole internet on our index. So we try to capture what is the real-time traffic that's passing by in our browsers. And to do so, we did an experiment with 50 grad students over a time span of 10 weeks, and we were actually collecting 4.7 million requests. How did we collect that data? Actually, we made a custom-made browser extension, and that extension was installed in the browsers of the grad students. It was fully transparent in the sense they knew that the extension was installed in their browser, but they didn't have any experience. So they didn't have any website that was not loaded. The website was loaded, was rendered as usual, but only data was logged to a log file on their system. And actually they had to install the extension themselves, and they had to actually do the logging because they had to write a report based on that logging. So they actually were forced to use it in their daily behavior to collect as much requests as possible. And for each of the requests going out of your browser, that log custom extension was actually logging information about the originator. If you're sending a request, where does it come from? So it could be the domain where you were browsing, but also which DOM element. Is it an image you're fetching? Was it a script that was actually fetching that request? Which scheme? And all the information about the originator. But also about the request itself, to what domain was that request sent, which scheme was used, which method, what was the URL, what input parameters, what cookies, whether HTTP authentication was used, whether there was a redirect, whether there was user interaction. So we try to log as much information as possible for each of the requests going out of the browser. Of course, when we are logging a lot of information, we also had to make some privacy considerations, and we actually took 3 steps. The first step was when we were recording data like input parameters and cookies, we were only recording the keys, not the actual values. Also for the HTTP authentication credentials, we only logged the fact that that you used HTTP authentication, not what was your username or password. Secondly, we didn't record full URLs, we only recorded the file name and the extension, so only the last part of the URL to preserve some privacy. And the third technique we used was also trying to record no client information. We used no browse information except for the version of the logger, because we had different versions of our logger. We didn't record any IP information, and we didn't record any username. So with all the data recorded, about 5 million requests, we could actually see what data is actually cross-domain. When we were considering all those requests, we saw when we were enforcing origins based on the definition of the same origin policy, that about 43% of all requests that were sent out by your browser are cross-domain requests. This could mean that you're fetching images from other domains. It could mean that you post a form to another domain, but also that you're just linking to another domain, so that you click on a link and you're starting a browsing session on another domain. Of course, because a lot of websites use subdomains, we also try to see what is the impact of relaxing the same origin policy to the relaxed same origin policy, meaning you only look to the top level domains of the URLs. So google.com means also all the subdomains of google.com. But still, when doing that relaxation, we saw that about 33% of all the traffic was still cross-domain. So it means 1/3 of all requests you're sending out are actually going to another domain than the domain you're surfing to. We also looked a little bit more deeper into the request itself. So if you're looking only to the cross-domain request, what are the characteristics? We see that almost 35% of all the GET requests are using input parameters, that only a small fraction of the links or the requests that are sent out were user-initiated. And with user-initiated, we mean you click a link or you click a form submission. So it means that most of the content is actually retrieved automatically by using JavaScript XHR or by using, for example, images within your using a style sheet, all the automatically downloaded information for one web page. We also saw that from the cookies, 35% of the requests were using cookies, and a very small fraction of the requests were using HTTP authentication. So I already recalled that most numbers were on input parameters and cookies. About 35% of those requests have those parameters and have those cookies. And HTTP authentication is very limited. When we're looking to the total number of domains, we saw that in our request we are recording about 5 million requests, only 2 domains were actually using HTTP authentication. So of the 5 million requests, we saw that there were actually about 24,000 different domains that were actually providing content to our browser. 40% of them were actually using redirects in one of those responses, and 23% of the domains were using cookies, were providing sessions to the end user via cookies. So this is a basic data set, and the data set was sufficient for us to have a look to cross-site request forgery and the different techniques to mitigate cross-site request forgery. But it's actually very interesting to have such data sets to do some benchmarking and also to compare different solutions. So I think we in our community really need to process on that behavior. We need to proceed and try to fetch and to collect more data that we can publicly use to compare different solutions, but also have a grip on the security solutions that we need to deploy. So we have already seen a few characteristics of the data. One important observation can already be cross-domain traffic is everywhere in our browser. 1/3 of our request is cross-domain traffic. So it's not that easy to say, well, the main mitigation technique against cross-site request forgery, we just disallow all requests to be cross-domain. We need to find a clever way of deciding whether requests are malicious or benign. So let's have a look to the mitigation techniques that are existing against cross-site request forgery and focusing on that topic that balance a little bit later on. The first thing is there are existing a lot of countermeasures against cross-site request forgery. For those who actually were attending last year's presentation on cross-site request forgery, I gave an overview of all the different mitigation techniques. You can find that on video of the last conference. For this talk, I will only shortly discuss the same origin policy, the token-based approaches, and then focus on the client-side mitigation. So the same origin policy itself does not provide any means against cross-site request forgery. You are still allowed to send out requests to other domains, but it's a very important enabler for the token-based approaches. And the token-based approaches are actually a very promising technique. They actually make a protocol between the client and the server within one origin, and the same origin policy actually prohibits other domains to read secrets that they share between the client and the server. Although it's very promising, we see on the traffic on the net that it's not widely deployed yet. So it's a very good countermeasure on the server side to deploy, but a lot of websites still not deploying a token-based approach. So actually we are forced to provide good means for end users to protect themselves against cross-site request forgery at this moment, because not all the websites are protecting themselves on the server side yet. One way to actually get client-side protection is taking the token-based approach into account and putting it on the client side. And this is actually what is done in request